All right, so let's take a look at some Chapter 1 information, talking about terms and things like that. Okay, so when we are introducing this class, we were saying that this class is like a science class and a lab class all kind of tied into one. And so when we're talking about all this vocabulary that we have, it starts right off the bat with the idea of anatomy and physiology. So on the one hand, you look at that and you're like, well, I don't even know why they have two terms. It seems like it's all the same. Anatomy, physiology is talking about the body and its parts, right? But in fact, there's a difference, and this is something that we'll see again and again, that anatomy is about structure. It's about the name of the part, etc. So the anatomy is the structure, and the physiology is going to be the actual function of that part. Okay? So one is structure and one is function. And so when we talk about anatomy and physiology, we're going to be looking at the different parts, but the shape of the part and the number of it and what it has attached to it and stuff like that will often then tie to what it does. So one of the simplest examples you might have would be like the different types of teeth that you have. So when we get to the digestive system, we'll talk about the different types of teeth. But in essence, right, you've been to the dentist, there's incisors, and there's canines, and there's premolars and molars. And if you look at the shapes of those teeth, they're different because they have different functions. Or, if you want to look at it another way, they're able to have different functions because they have different shapes. The ones in the back are more what we call malariform. They're very broad and flat so that you can really smash or macerate the food, right, and grind it. Meanwhile, the ones in the front, their surface is very sharp. Right? So the canines and the incisors, they don't have a lot of flat area, but that's good, like knives almost, for biting pieces off of larger things, right? So they have different shapes and allows them to do different things. And so we're always going to see, as we're going through these different systems, this direct link between structure and function and how they're always very tightly correlated. Okay? Okay. So one of the other things that we're going to see very regularly is we're trying to figure out how the body works. And when we're thinking about how the body works, we're looking at all these different systems and how they contribute to keeping you alive. And so each of the different systems, organ systems, are going to have different organs in them, and they're all going to be trying to help to keep you alive in some particular way. And so one of the things we have to look at is what are going to be the essential functions of living things. And on that level, you know, you could be talking about, you know, a cactus outside over here. You could be talking about a round-tailed ground squirrel running around that you see on campus, or you could be talking about you. Or, if you even go smaller, when we start talking about the organization of the body, we find that there's this hierarchy in terms of how the body's organized, right? The biggest level is you as a whole organism, right? You're one living thing, you're a whole organism, but you're made up of all these different organ systems, right? So an organ system like the respiratory system and the nervous system and stuff like that. Those organ systems are made up of individual organs, etc. When we get down very small, we've got the individual cells. And the individual cells that make up you, they work together in order to make you as a living thing. But each one of those things is a living unit, a living cell. So when we're looking at us and talking about all the different things that we have to do to keep us alive, each individual cell in your body also has to do all of those things to keep itself alive. Okay? Now, it's going to do it on a much, much reduced level, but it's still going to happen. So when we look at things, we've got a lot of essential functions. So movement. This could be something more complex like moving the entire living organism places, right? So if you're talking about like us or like the round-tailed ground squirrel or something like that, they need to move to regulate body temperature, so they need to get in the shade during the day or something like that. They need to go find food. They need to get away from predators. That's moving the whole organism. But inside of a living organism, those living cells, they may be stationary, like cells of the skin or cells of your heart, but they have internal components that can move too. So they have organelles, like mini organs inside of them, that make different things, and they're transported to different areas of the cell where they're needed. And so they're still, even though the cell the living unit might not move, inside of the cell there's a lot of movement. So on some level, even if it's not entirely obvious to you, a living thing has to move, right? Cactus, you're wondering, it doesn't move, but there's things that are moving inside of it, right? Nutrients and water and things like that. Okay, so responsiveness is also a very important function for a living organism because we have to be able to respond to the world around us. And even as we were just using those examples, like even the round-tailed ground squirrel running and hiding to get away from predators or hiding underneath a rock so it doesn't get too hot, being able to respond to the external environment is going to be important, either to get away from negative things or to get positive things, right? Go get food or something like that. So responding to the external environment is going to be important because that's where like our nutrients are going to come from, that's where our oxygen comes from, and all these essential other things that we need. Growth is going to be important also. You know, all these living things start very, very small and very complex, and then they grow from there. And so growth, that can occur from, if we're talking about juveniles to adults, but it can also be on a smaller level when we're thinking about like repair. So if you get a cut or something like that, the cells that were damaged or removed, they actually need to be replaced. And so they need to grow and grow and grow, and then they'll fill in that area and heal that particular area over. So there's lots of different possibilities for growth, but those are definitely necessary for a living thing. Reproduction as well. Now, that also has two different levels. Number one, reproduction in terms of making new individuals, so the species is still around. But even within an individual, reproduction, you can think about that on a cellular level. So like we were talking about, if you have one cell, you're going to run out of cells, right? Cells and living things, they wear out through time. Skin cells slough off all the time. Red blood cells that are going around in you only last about 4 months before they wear out. So we actually crank out, our bone marrow cranks out like 2 million new red blood cells every second in order to replace those that are wearing out. And so we've got to reproduce cells all the time to replace those that are wearing out or that are removed or whatever. So reproduction is going to be important too. Respiration is going to be important. So what's respiration? What does that mean to us at this point? Breathing, right? So for us, there's going to be respiration in terms of exchanging gas with the outside environment. But even on a cellular level, it's going to need oxygen. It's going to produce carbon dioxide. And so on that level, it's more about gas exchange. Now, it's not going to actually have little mini lungs and things like that, but you'll actually have oxygen coming into it and being used by the cell and carbon dioxide being produced and actually exiting the cell. Okay? So respiration is certainly very important. It's funny, actually, if you think about it, all the different cells in our body, all the billions of cells in our body, need to respire. They need oxygen in order to do what they need to do, right? Whether it's a muscle cell contracting or a neuron sending signals or even a skin cell just surviving. And so we have an entire respiratory system that has a function of bringing oxygen into our body, and then a cardiovascular system which routes the oxygen out to the cells because those cells need the oxygen and they need to get rid of the carbon dioxide. So even on a microscopic level, it's like the cells in our body are running the show. We have this whole lungs and trachea and stuff like that in order to support all these billions of cells that are around the body that need the oxygen and need to get rid of the carbon dioxide. Okay, so we've got respiration. Then there is digestion. So digestion, we have a system for that. The cells have to do it too, but in that case, what we're talking about is taking large nutrients and breaking them down small enough so that they can be used as building blocks for building what we need to survive. Okay? So it's kind of like Legos, if you will, where we take in large items, we spend effort breaking them down into something that's small enough that we can then, for us as an organism, put them into the bloodstream, distribute them to the cells can pick them up, and the cells can actually use them to synthesize or make the things that they need. So for instance, when we're taking in meats and stuff like that, it's a lot of protein. Proteins, our digestive system, both physically and chemically break down proteins into their building blocks that are called amino acids, right? Like Legos, right? You have this big structure, you break it down into its individual blocks, you can use those blocks again to build something else new. And that's what the cells do. The cells need to, so that they don't wear out, they need to replace parts of themselves or make new cells, and they need the building blocks to be able to do that. So our digestive system and digestion overall for a living thing is about taking nutrients and being able to synthesize things that we need. So absorption is also important, and that just means that we're going to get these things that we need, like oxygen and nutrients, etc., and we've got to be able to get them inside of us or inside of the cells, right? It's one thing to be a cell sitting in a solution that has lots of oxygen and nutrients and stuff floating around you. It's another thing if you can't get to it. It's like being on the other side of the candy store window in an ice cream store. You're like, oh, it's there, I can't get it, right? So it's one thing for it to be there, but you've got to be able to get it inside in order to get a benefit from it. Circulation is also important. So circulation, right, you get the idea of movement, etc. For some of these other functions, they occur in very limited areas of our body, right? So digestive system, right, you got a stomach, you got small intestines, those are located in particular places in your body. Respiratory system, only located in here, right? So all the cells right here are good, right? Oxygen and carbon dioxide, this is all being exchanged here. But what about the muscle cells in the bottom of your foot? They are so far away, the oxygen is not going to diffuse over there. We need a circulatory system to distribute these things around. Both get things to the cells, but also get things away from the cells. And that's going to be important regardless of how big you are as an organism and as a living thing. Assimilation kind of goes along with digestion and absorption, etc. So when you get those nutrients and you've broken them down, you can assimilate and basically build other things that you need to. So you can make use of the things that you digested and the things that you brought into the cell. Okay? So you've got to be able to use those things to your benefit so that you can survive. And then in any building process, there's going to be some things that are useful and some things that are not. And when you're going through this process of building, there's usually going to be some waste products. So excretion, getting rid of waste products is going to be important on a macroscopic scale, a big scale, but also on a cellular scale. They've got to be able to get rid of their waste products too. So that ties into circulatory system and things like that. Okay. So these are different activities or functions that living things need to do. These are a list of substances that living things need. Now some of these are pretty straightforward, right? Especially in the desert, we realize the necessity of water, more so. But that is certainly the case even on a cellular basis, right? So the cells of your skin and the muscle cells, etc., they have a bunch of gel-like fluid inside of them that's called intracellular fluid, and it is also made up of water, a lot of water. And so when you're talking about, you hear these stats about you're made up of like 75% water, etc., you're made up mostly of cells, and inside of those cells is also a bunch of water. You know, you have all those little organelles, but they're floating in that gel-like matrix, which is mostly water. And then outside of cells, we've got more water, call that interstitial fluid, plasma, stuff like that. So there's a lot of fluid in there, so we need to retain that water. Yeah? The water inside of cells, let me get that up here. Where's my cursor? Oh, it's way over there. It's called intracellular fluid, like that, okay? I-N-T-R-A, cell, C-E-L-L-U-R, fluid. So what that means is the intra part there means within, okay? So intra means within, and of course the cellular part means cell. So this is fluid that's found inside of the cell. The other way, or the other term that sometimes we hear, is called extracellular fluid, like that. And so extracellular, right, extra is like exterior, it means outside. So we have extracellular fluid. So if you think about the blood, you've got different cells in there, red blood cells, white blood cells, etc., but there's also a bunch of fluid that they're floating in. So that fluid is called plasma. That is extracellular fluid. Meanwhile, if you were to take one of those red blood cells and bust it open, there would be a gel-like fluid on the inside. That would be intracellular fluid. all mostly made up of water. Okay. Then we also have needs of nutrients, right? So we need food, we need oxygen, we need heat as well. Now, whether you are an homeothermic organism where you generate your own heat internally and maintain it, or whether you are something like a cold-blooded organism. If you look in the terraria downstairs, right, there's lots of rattlesnakes and lizards. We have a Gila monster down there, like 6 different types of native rattlesnakes. Sometimes you'll see those rattlesnakes all like huddled up on one rock, right? That's because there's a heat rock underneath there. Particularly, if you guys walk downstairs and where the labs are and everything, there's 2 smaller terraria built into the walls of 2 of the labs. So one of those has a bunch of native species of frog in it, and you can see the frogs, they have signs outside. The other one has a bunch of what we call montane rattlesnakes. So those are found in the higher elevations in Arizona. And there's a couple different types of rattlesnakes in there that will quite commonly be on the same rock, and they're just like be huddled with each other, something you would totally not see in the wild, but they're trying to regulate their temperature, and so they're on that heat rock together like that. So heat's pretty important, but like with many of these things, we want to make sure we have enough, but not too much too. And so when we're talking about heat, we'll talk about how in the body we work to regulate heat so that we maintain it at right about the right level, if you will. So what's the normal body temperature for us? Yeah, so it's like 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that. It gets a little bit warmer and a little bit cooler, but if it gets off of that, then we have various mechanisms that we use to try to get it back to that set point. We try to maintain it around there. Now, pressure is one that, you know, maybe most people wouldn't think of when they're looking at requirements for living things, but there are some pressures, if you think about it, that are certainly very important. One of them is blood pressure, right? You don't have enough blood pressure, or you have too much blood pressure, there's going to be problems. You're not going to be able to distribute your blood around to the organs that need it, or you're going to put too much stress on the system, something's going to blow out. Also, when we're talking about the respiratory system and exchanging air, that also operates according to pressure, movement of air from an area of high pressure to low pressure, and it tends to move in one way or the other. So pressure is also very important. All right, so one of the things that we were mentioning when we were describing all these things that we need, and when we were talking about heat, is the fact that for many of these factors, we maintain a specific level in the body. And so for heat, we were saying 98.6 degrees is common, and we try to maintain that. So we have this term that's called homeostasis. And homeostasis is how our bodies maintain a stable internal condition. Now, when we look at that definition, right, homeo means the same, and stasis means kind of, again, kind of unchanging. And so a stable internal condition means that it's not always exactly at what we call the set point, right? So, like we said, body temperature, 98.6 degrees. It's not always exactly 98.6 degrees. If I have you guys run outside, go to your car, tag your car, and come back here, and we take your body temperature, it will not be 98.6 degrees. It will be elevated for a period of time. Your muscles are contracting and generating heat, and your body's trying to get rid of it, but it takes some time to do so, okay? So there is some variation in that system, but it's trying to maintain a stable, right? So it's not too much variance in your internal conditions, and that could be things like temperature, or oxygen levels, or nutrient levels, or even waste product levels that we don't want to accumulate too high, okay? So the maintenance of a stable internal condition is very important because our different cells, etc., need a set of conditions that is stable. So just like we were talking about the rattlesnakes downstairs, they're also trying to maintain their temperature and maintain their nutrients and stuff like that. So they have to eat regularly, they have to take breaths regularly to get oxygen, they have to go on a heat rock if they get too cold, etc. So the way that we do it, though, is more internally controlled. And so usually what we have are different things that we call homeostatic systems. And a homeostatic system is kind of like when you're at home and you have your whole like air conditioning unit and stuff like that, okay? So if you think about that system, you've got something that is a set point or control center, right? So what's that called in the house? Right, the thermostat, right? So there's a box somewhere in your house where you can go and you can set the temperature. So that's the control center there. So for us, that's basically going to be the brain usually, or the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. It's going to be the control center working on maintaining the internal condition. Now, usually it's going to have a set point. So if the control center needs to know where it's supposed to be set, right? So you have the dial, or you can punch in the numbers, and you can set it to 79 degrees. So that's the set point, and then the control center's job is to maintain it there, right? With that, inside of that box, there's also a receptor or a sensor. Because if you tell the thermostat it's supposed to maintain 79 degrees, if there's no receptor, then it's happy as a clam. It's like, yeah, sure, I think it's 79 in here. I can't tell at all, but as far as I can see, it's 79 degrees in here, right? In order for that to be efficient, it has to have a receptor. In that case, it would be a thermoreceptor, right? A temperature sensor, a thermometer, which measures temperature. So then the control center can look at the set point, 79 degrees, look at the actual temperature, and see if those two match. If they don't match, then we need to take action to make them match in order to maintain the internal conditions, in that case of your house, right? So the last thing that a homeostatic system needs is an effector. So something that will produce the desired effect. And so for your home heating and cooling system, that's going to be your air conditioning unit outside or your heating unit, right? So if the thermostat sees that 79 degrees out in the house, set point 79 degrees, and it's like 85 degrees in the house, it needs to turn on the air conditioner, the effector, to bring that temperature back down, right? So when it gets done doing that, though, we'll find that it has to be able to turn itself off as well. It's not a very good system for maintaining stable conditions if all of a sudden it gets too hot in here, air conditioner comes on, and then it just stays on for the next 2 years, right? It's not going to maintain 79 degrees. Now it's just going to get colder and colder and colder. So these systems have to consistently monitor what's going on inside and make little tweaks and little changes so that we stay just about around that set point. So that's the stable internal condition. And we have different types of sensors in the body that do that. We have different types of systems in the body that monitor different things, right? So this is what we talked about in terms of sensor, control center, and effector there, and some of their definitions. Now, one of the things that we didn't mention in terms of a term yet, but we already were talking about, was this thing called negative feedback, okay? Now, negative feedback, if you are at your job, is maybe a bad thing, right? So you go to your job, you do something wrong, and your boss gives you negative feedback and a bad review, and then you feel bad about yourself, and you wonder whether you should quit, and whether you've made the right choice, and maybe you should go back to school and get new classes and go somewhere else. And that's good for us, because then we see you here. But in terms of maintaining your internal condition, negative feedback, by definition, opposes an initial change. So what that means is, if inside of your body or inside of this room, it's set to 79 degrees and it starts to get too warm, a negative feedback system will kind of nudge it back down to the set point. So any way it starts getting away from the set point, this negative feedback system will push it back towards the set point. It opposes whatever change just happened, right? So it's kind of like when you're driving on the road, right? You start to drift a little bit to the left, then you nudge the steering wheel back so that you stay on the straight and narrow, so you stay in that lane, okay? So that's what a negative feedback system does. It opposes an initial change, and that way it maintains that condition. And so most of our body systems in maintaining our living condition operate under negative feedback, okay? So this slide here just kind of goes through that in a graphical way. So it talks about, if the temperature gets off or something like that, then we've got to go through a series of steps in order to fix the situation. Now, instead of our air conditioning unit or something like that, if the body temperature gets too low, our internal thermoreceptors are going to sense that, relay that signal to the brain. The brain will then compare that with where it's supposed to be and figure out that it needs to make a change. one of the ways that you can generate heat in the body very efficiently is to contract your different skeletal muscles, whether that's shivering or just actually moving them more, or actually they can generate a little bit more tension, just very low level, and that will generate heat. But that will increase the temperature. Once the temperature comes up to where it should be, then we can stop doing that, right? If you're really cold and you start shivering, you don't just shiver for the next year. You shiver until you warm up, and then the shivering stops because you've reached that set point again. Now, positive feedback, in terms of your job, that might be a good thing. But in terms of the body, it's not so good for maintaining an internal condition. Positive feedback, by definition, amplifies an initial change. So if we were to think about an example of that would be like in your house. Say the temperature in the house during the day, it starts to heat up. It starts to get like 80, 85 degrees. In a positive feedback system, the sensor would go off and say, hey, it's getting hot in here. And in a positive feedback system, the control center would go, hey, it's getting hot in here. Let's make it hotter. Let's turn on the heater. And then it goes up and up and up. It amplifies that initial change. As you can imagine, that's not a good way to maintain feedback and kind of maintain that internal condition and keep it around the set point. It's going to shoot it off even further and make your situation worse. So there are very, very few examples of positive feedback in the body, because then our different set points and our different conditions will be going all over the place. Now, there are a couple of examples, though. One is blood clotting. So blood clotting, if you have a cut vessel and you're bleeding all over the place, it's very important that you form a clot very quickly and that it continues to strengthen itself so that it doesn't blow out again and you start bleeding all over the place. Okay? So when we get the cardiovascular system, we'll find that the clotting cascade, which initially forms the clot, is a positive feedback. Once it starts forming stronger and stronger and stronger. Just like, you know, if you were to put like a little patch on the hose, if you put a patch on the hose, a little piece of tape, that's probably not going to hold for too long. You need to put, you know, some strong duct tape on it. You need to make sure it's going to hold. So that's the case for positive feedback, but it's rare in the body. And in fact, when we get the cardiovascular system, we'll find that there's another mechanism that comes in, a separate mechanism that actually takes the clot away and stops the process, but it's separate. The other example for positive feedback in the body is childbirth. So childbirth, though, if you think about it, it's where we're actually switching from one set point to another. We're going from where we've been maintaining two individuals, and we need to shift back to maintaining just one individual. And so that whole labor process is actually a positive feedback, but we're switching, like we said, from maintaining two back to maintaining one. And so, again, we'll talk about it when we get the reproductive system at the end of the semester, but the cycle in terms of the labor cycle, that feedback mechanism is like this, right? So when the baby is large enough and positioned low enough in the uterus down towards the cervix, there's a bunch of sensors, right? Because we have to have sensors down there which are called stretch receptors. They're mechanoreceptors. They will send a signal when you bend them or when you stretch them, as opposed to when the temperature changes, okay? So those stretch receptors start sending a signal. It says, hey, we're being stretched here. There's a big baby head here and stuff like that. So it starts sending the signals back up to the brain. The brain responds by releasing hormones that's called oxytocin. Sometimes in the hospital, people will get more oxytocin. It's called Pitocin. They get it injected if the labor is not going fast enough, okay? But that hormone is a chemical messenger that goes down to the uterus and tells the uterus to start contracting, because there's smooth muscle along the wall of the uterus. When that starts contracting, then those stretch receptors are going to get even more stretched, because now they're, I'm being compressed against the baby. So then they respond by saying, oh, hey, you know what? We're being stretched some more. They send the signal up to the brain. Brain says, okay, how about some more oxytocin? And then the labor continues. The contractions get more forceful and more frequent until the birth happens. And that's when we're then shifting from maintaining the two to maintaining the one. But that type of process, like we said, we're shifting set points. So that's, at that point, it's okay to push from where we were, where we're maintaining this other individual inside of us. Now we want to switch to where that individual is out and on its own. So very few examples for positive feedback, though. Okay. So what we'll find as we go through this semester is that we're going to be looking at all of these different organ systems of the body and how they maintain us homeostatically. What are the different factors that they are working to control and regulate? How are they doing it? And how are they maintaining us as a living thing? So what we'll find is, and if we looked at the syllabus already, you see that most of our focus is at the organ system level, right? So what are some of the organ systems that you guys know already? Right, so stomach's an organ, part of the digestive system. What other systems? Right, so cardiovascular system, right? What else? Nervous system is another one. Yeah. What's it? Endocrine system, right? So the hormones, stuff like that. Lots of different examples. Those systems are made up of a bunch of different types of organs. So Roman was saying endocrine system as well, right? So what we can see is, even though in this course we kind of focus on the organ system level, each organ system, which helps to maintain us, is made up of a bunch of individual organs. Digestive system is certainly a very good example of that, right? So you've got parts in the mouth, different organs, right? The tongue and stuff like that. You've got the esophagus and the stomach and the small intestine and the liver and the pancreas and the gallbladder and the large intestine. All of these are individual organs that contribute to that system in helping to maintain homeostasis, okay? All right, so the individual organs, though, are also made up of these things that are called tissues. A tissue, as opposed to Kleenex, a tissue is where we've got a bunch of cells that are usually attached together that are performing a function with each other. So, for instance, muscle tissue is all about contraction, whether it's skeletal muscles or whether it's cardiac muscle or whatever. So it's a bunch of those individual muscle cells that are physically linked together and working usually as a group, okay? So that's a tissue. Of course, cells are the individual units below that. These are the smallest living individual unit of the body is the cell. Now the cells inside of them have these little mini organs called organelles, because just like we have organs that help to complete these different functions, these living functions, a cell is a living thing, and it needs to complete those functions too. So it's got mini organs that do that. It's got like a mini digestive system and a mini moving system, etc. Okay? Now the organelles and things smaller than that, we get onto a chemical level where we're talking about molecules and ions and things like that. So carbon dioxide, that's a molecule, right? A protein is a very large, complex molecule that we use for nutrients and things. Calcium is an ion. It's very important in terms of our bones and our muscles, etc. Okay? So those things are certainly very important. Those are certainly the building blocks that we use to make the organelles, to make the cells, to make the tissues, to make the organs, organ systems, and on up. So the point is at the very beginning here, we're going to look at some of these lower levels. There's going to be a chapter that we go through next. It's a chapter on chemistry. It's not a chemistry class to be sure, but when we're talking about how these different organ systems work, when the cells are doing various things and they're knitting together and making proteins or digesting things or whatever, that's going to be on a chemical level. So we have to have a little bit of foundation about how these different parts of matter work together and knit them together or break them apart, etc. Okay? So we're going to have a little bit of chemistry, but then up from there, the next chapter is going to be cell. And so the cell chapter is really just going to be looking at, okay, what is a cell? What do we typically find in a cell? It's got a plasma membrane to it, a cell membrane, it's got a nucleus. What does a nucleus do? What are these organelles that we're talking about? How does it live? How does it move, etc.? So we learn about cells on a generic level, and then we move up to, very quickly we move up to kind of organs and organ systems, because at that level what we can do is when we get to, for instance, cardiovascular system, we already know about how cells work generically, but now we want to know, how does a cardiac muscle cell work, right? So it has to stay alive, and it has a nucleus and all that type of thing, but how does it do its job of contracting? And then once we understand how a cardiac muscle cell contracts, well, that's what allows the heart itself to contract, which pumps the blood, which sends it out through the arteries and veins, which allows all the other cells to survive. So the thing is that even though we're going to focus on the organ system level, like the different chapters, integumentary system and skeletal system, stuff like that, oftentimes when we get into it, we're going to go down to the cellular level, understand what the cells do, and now we can understand what the tissues, what the organ systems do. Okay? Okay. So what we see here is a list of our different organ systems in the body. All right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 organ systems of the body. Okay? So that's most of the different chapters that we have in the book. Now, some of these organ systems are a little bit more complex. The nervous system is pretty complex. Cardiovascular system is pretty complex. Reproductive system, it's only one system, but there's two pretty different versions of it. So that takes a little bit more as well. So that's why we have more than 11 chapters in the book, because sometimes we need a little bit more. But these are the different systems, and when we look at their generic functions, this is just going to introduce them to us. But through the semester, we're going to be looking at each one of these and how they work and what their components are. So circulatory system is about delivery, right? Taking things to the cells, but also picking things up from the cells. Digestive system is about breaking things down, big things to small things. Respiratory system is about exchanging gases, right? Oxygen and carbon dioxide. Urinary system is a system that removes liquid waste and small molecules from our body. So there's not really, from time to time you hear people talking about an excretory system. It's not really an excretory system, right? There's a urinary system for fluid and small molecules so we can get rid of those. And then the digestive system has a way of getting rid of larger unwanted components, okay? So there's no real excretory system. So urinary, skeletal, right, which is support and also movement, because the muscular system in most cases attaches to the skeletal to move it around. Integumentary system is the skin, and this is always an interesting one because it counts as an organ system. It also just counts as an organ. You hear that stat or that kind of trivia about the skin being the largest organ of the body. So an organ, by definition, is where we have more than one tissue type working together for a particular function. And when we talk about the integumentary system, we'll see that that's true. Then we have the immune system. The immune system of all these systems, if we were going to ask you guys to list different systems that you know, that's the one that people tend to forget about. Immune system, it's defending us against what we call pathogens, foreign invaders, etc. But the immune system, unlike our other systems, it doesn't have a lot of big organs that are very obvious to it, right? Cardiovascular system, you're like, oh, okay, heart and artery and stuff like that. And nervous system, you're like, okay, brain. You're picturing these big organs. The immune system doesn't really have a lot of those. It operates usually down on the cellular level instead. Then we have nervous system, as we just mentioned. Endocrine system is one that people often forget too. Two control systems of the body, okay? These are like the control center aspect, where they're maintaining homeostasis and stuff. So nervous system is like the wired system. It has a direct connection to whatever it needs to do, right? Those are the nerves and the neurons. So if it needs a muscle to contract, there's a neuron that makes that path all the way from the brain and the spinal cord to that exact muscle. If it stopped halfway, the message wouldn't get there. It has to be like a phone line, not a wireless phone. A phone line would have to go right there all the way, okay? Now, endocrine system is more like the wireless system. It can actually communicate over long distances. You can have an endocrine gland be here. It secretes a hormone that goes into the blood, and then that message ends up at the target organ. But it doesn't have to have a direct connection that way. And the last one is reproductive system. Now, reproductive system, of all of the different 11 systems in the body, reproductive system probably has the least to do with homeostasis. It's not much about maintaining your internal condition. It's more about making new individuals instead. So, okay. So, when we start to get into talking about these different systems and things like that, one of the things we have to do is we have to look at this terminology like we were talking about before, and different types of specific terms that we would use. We're going to find that with our different systems, but we're also going going to need it when we are doing charting in our particular, programs that we're entering into, right? Radiological technician or sonography or whatever. You've got to be able to describe where the break is or how the baby was oriented or something like that, right? So we've got to use specific terminology. So when we talk about organization in the body, where we can find things like these organs and organ systems, a lot of these organs are going to be contained within cavities or spaces within the body. And so there's a couple of major cavities in the body, and they're kind of like those. You guys ever seen those Russian dolls? You get the big one, you open it up, and the small one, and open it up, and the small one, right? Those are kind of like the different body cavities. We're going to have some big body cavities, but those big body cavities are going to be subdivided into smaller ones, okay? So for instance, there is what's called a dorsal cavity and a ventral cavity. The dorsal cavity that we see here, okay, dorsal is like the posterior, right? So dorsal, if you think of, right, it was just Shark Week recently, so if you think of the dorsal fin of a shark, where is it? It's on its back, right? So that is the dorsal surface of you as well. It's going to be your back. So the dorsal cavity is going to be more towards the posterior. It has a cranial cavity that houses the brain and a vertebral cavity that houses the spinal cord, making it up, okay? So these are the two smaller cavities that make up the dorsal cavity. Then we've got the ventral cavity. Ventral cavity is bigger, true cavity with larger spaces in it. The ventral cavity includes the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavity. We can see it here in this frontal view. The thoracic cavity, right, the thorax is basically the chest, and the thoracic cavity subdivides into some smaller cavities. There are pleural cavities here and here, where the lungs are. There is a pericardial cavity, which is where the heart exists. And then in between all of those, there's called the mediastinum, which is kind of the area superior to the heart, up above the heart, and more medial compared to the lungs. It's like where the esophagus and the trachea are and things like that. Okay, so that's the thoracic cavity. The abdominal pelvic cavity splits into only two. You've got an abdominal cavity up here and a pelvic cavity that is kind of surrounded by your pelvic bones. It makes kind of a bowl, okay? So with these different cavities, you'll find when you get to the lab, right, that these are some of the things you're going to have to know. You're going to have to name these different cavities, and you would have to be able to say, be able to point out. If I gave you a diagram and I point to one of those cavities, you have to tell me the name of it, right, using the specific language, and you might have to tell me, okay, name one organ that's inside of that cavity. Now, some of them, like abdominal pelvic, you've got lots of different choices. Some other ones, like cranial cavity, you got one shot at that one, right? So that's kind of an idea about how you're going to be using this information in very short order. Yeah?
Thoracic cavity, that was all including the left and the right, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Correct. So thoracic cavity is going to have a right pleural cavity and a left pleural cavity contained within it. Yeah. Okay. So body organization. What we also find is that with these different cavities, they're going to contain organs, and the organs are usually suspended within them, kind of hanging there, but they're also kind of loosely organized because most of these organs, like we talked about before, they move. And so when you've got the stomach churning, right, it has to be doing these mixing movements, the heart's going to be beating and stuff like that. When it's sitting in the cavity, number one, it's usually packed in there very tight, close to the wall of the cavity. And then number two, it may not be the only organ in that cavity. So the stomach, which is right next to the pancreas, which is right next to the liver and stuff like that, and right next to the small intestine, all those things are like moving next to one another. If they were doing their movements and they didn't have any lubrication, if you will, when they're moving along, they can actually generate friction, right? And be like, and you get blisters on the outside, right? Blisters on your heart. That's a role of your boyfriend and girlfriend. It's not what you should be, right? So what you need is some lubrication that we have in the form of these membranes. So membranes will line cavities and line the outside of organs and make them slippery. So when they are moving, they will move very easily past one another, okay? Now, of course, we can't just generically say membrane. They have to have specific terms, right? So here are some examples of different body membranes. So what we've got are different types of, in this case, internal membranes. These membranes here are ones that are going to be lining cavities. So we've got if you have one that lines the outside of the cavity, lining the cavity itself, it's called a parietal membrane. The larger category of these membranes are called serous membranes. Now that word looks like serious, but notice that there's no I on it. It's serous. Serous membranes are membranes that line organs and cavities that don't open up to the outside. Okay? So we're talking about things that are contained within the abdominal pelvic cavity, like on the outside of the stomach and the outside of the liver and stuff like that. This cavity doesn't have any direct opening to the outside, or at least it shouldn't unless you've been shivved or something like that, and then you're in a bad way already. But serous membranes are either going to line the cavity or they're going to line the outside of that organ. And so like we said, that way when the heart is beating in the pericardial cavity, it's not generating friction. Okay? So we call it a parietal membrane when it's lining the cavity. We call it a visceral membrane when it's on the surface of the organ itself. Okay? So, like with the heart, there is what's called a visceral pericardium, right? When you look at pericardial down below, cardia, like cardiac arrest, cardia means heart. So a pericardial membrane, there is a visceral pericardium, which is like saran wrap. It's right on the surface of the heart. Okay? There's a parietal pericardium that lines that same cavity. So that way, the cavity has a slick membrane to it. The heart itself on the outside has a slick membrane to it. And when it's moving very smoothly next to this wall of the cavity. Okay? So, parietal and visceral. Parietal is going to be lining the cavity. Visceral is going to be on the outside of the organ. Pericardial are examples. Pleural, we said pleural cavities are the lung cavities. There are pleural membranes too. Those lungs are also changing shape in the cavity. So there is a pleural, what's called a parietal pleura, which lines those pleural cavities. There is a visceral pleura, or a membrane right on the surface of the lung, which makes sure that that lung, when it's inflating and deflating, is very smooth. Okay? The last one here, peritoneum or peritoneal, are going to be membranes that line the abdominal pelvic organs, right? So visceral peritoneum, outside of the stomach, outside of the intestine and stuff like that, making it slimy like that. The parietal peritoneum is going to be right on the wall of the abdominal pelvic cavity, okay? So when you're seeing those horror movies in very short order and people are getting like cut open and it looks all slippery and gooey in there, likely because of these peritoneal membranes making those organs different slippery, nice and slippery like that. Okay. A couple other things in terms of terminology. Yeah, question. Yeah, so pleural refers to the lungs. So I can put that on there, right? So when we say pleural, that refers to lungs. When we say pericardial or cardia, that refers to the heart. And the peritoneal ones are going to refer to the abdominal organs instead. Okay. So a couple other things in terms of terminology, terms and terms. So if you're thinking about doing your charting and writing down your notes on your particular patient, when you're doing so, you can imagine that people in different medical fields, their patients may be, if you will, oriented in different ways, right? So if you are doing sonography or something like that, you're probably not going to be imaging the baby while she's standing up, right? She's usually laying down, but not totally laying down. So her upper body is kind of elevated. Though, you know, there are other ways. If you're working physical therapy or something like that, they might be standing up. You want to evaluate them in this type of position so you can see what's going on. You can check their flexibility, stuff like that. So when you're describing where these things are in their body, if you're describing like, you know, former surgeries or where the pain is or something like that, that's going to be different depending on how the body's oriented. So what they've come up with, the medical field has come up with, is something that's called anatomical position. An anatomical position is kind of like a standardized way of thinking of the position of your patient so that when people are writing notes, they can always think of their patient being oriented that way. So there's no question of, well, I'm not sure. Did he mean that when he said superior, is that superior on top of his head? Or wait a minute, he's laying down, so superior is up here because that's up now, right? You want to know exactly how they're going to be positioned. So anatomical position is where your patient is standing with their arms at their side and the palms of their hand facing forward or facing anteriorly. So there's always a picture in the book and the lab manual of that, and even the next slide where we have a picture of the different planes or cuts of the body. That's the anatomical position. So when you're writing your notes, you have to think about anatomical position, the standing type of orientation. Okay? There's a question coming in there. You can go ahead and type it in. We'll see what it is. All right. So that's for anatomical position. When we're talking about relative positions, these are different terms that are used in medical terminology. So, you certainly can still say, up and down and things like that, and higher and lower, etc. But these are the actual anatomical terms that are used and are more specific. So, Michelle says, what's the anatomical position one more time? The computer froze. So it's standing with your arms at your side and the palms of your hands face forward. Okay? So, in terms of relative positions, superior and inferior, these are going to come in pairs, right? So superior and inferior, these are pretty straightforward. Superior means above, and inferior means below. Okay, so we were talking about that before, right? So my nose is superior to my mouth. Now that being said, you always have to say what two things you're comparing. If we switch that around and we say, well, I want to know the position of my mouth relative to my nose instead, you would say my mouth is inferior to my nose, right? So it all depends on the relationship between the two. So superior and inferior. We also have anterior and posterior. Now anterior and posterior is basically front and back, right? Posterior, everybody's familiar with that one. Anterior is actually the opposite of that. So with anterior and posterior, there's actually two other words that go along with that, for humans anyway. Oops, there should be an L on the end of that. So dorsal and ventral, okay? So dorsal and ventral, dorsal is the same as posterior, and ventral is the same as anterior. So if you were talking about a quadruped, right, you're talking about like a cat or something like that, superior and inferior is a little bit different. Anatomical position for a cat is not standing up like this. That's like a horror movie. It's like coming on 2 feet at you, right? So anatomical position for a cat is down on all fours. So superior for a cat, right, is going to be a little bit different, and dorsal and ventral. Anterior, posterior, and dorsal and ventral. Dorsal for a cat is going to be towards its back like that. Ventral is going to be its belly, but posterior is going to be down towards its tail, and anterior is going to be up towards its head where it's going. Okay? So that's more general biology. For us, you can trade those out. That's dorsal and posterior, same thing. This is ventral and anterior, and you can switch them. It doesn't matter. As long as you know which ones pair up. If you like dorsal and ventral, because those are smaller words, that's fine. You can use those. But just know if somebody writes superior, or I'm sorry, if somebody writes posterior, you have to convert it in your mind, and you know that they're talking about the back. Okay? Okay, what else do we have? Medial and lateral. So medial and lateral are talking about to the side or in the middle, right? Medial sounds like middle. Lateral, if you think about like a football player or something like that, they're doing lateral, they're throwing the ball off to the side. So medial and lateral, you could say, right, that my eye is lateral to my nose. Or you could say like the lungs, right? The lung is lateral compared to my heart. You reverse that around, my heart is more medial, more towards the middle compared to my lungs, which are more off to the side. Okay? So that's medial and lateral. We also have proximal and distal. Proximal and distal are usually used with the limbs, even more so with the upper limb. When we're in anatomical position, those limbs are not straight up and down, right? There's an angle to them. So superior and inferior kind of works, but it's not exactly on top of one another, right? So if I'm going to say, well, my elbow, it's superior to my thumb, kind of, if you look above and to the side or something, but proximal and distal works a little bit better because when we look at those terms, distal means like at a distance, right? Proximal is just somebody's in close proximity, like a close talker, right? They're too close to you. So proximal and distal is talking about the distance out on the limb comparatively. So you could say my wrist is distal compared to my elbow, right? Or my shoulder is more proximal compared to my wrist. And you can use that on fingers and stuff like that if you want to.
And that's also based on the center of your body. straight in the middle?
It's more related to where that limb connects to the main part of the body. So the closer it is to where the limb connects, that's more proximal. The further out on the limb is more distal, at a distance.
Yeah, that's what I mean, like base.
Based on kind of the core of your body, the closer it is to there. Yeah. Now once you get here, everything's a little bit more vertical, so you can use medial and lateral. It's a little bit more right angles, but this makes it a little weird, so we use those instead. Okay? Okay. And superficial and deep. That one's pretty straightforward, right? Think about cuts. Superficial cut, not so deep. So it could be into the torso, it could be into your finger. So superficial and deep are two other anatomical terms. Okay? The last thing that we see has to do with either what we call planes or cuts. So if you're talking about doing a dissection or something like that, if you're talking about making cuts into something like you have, a sheep heart or something like that, you'll see photos of sheep hearts. If you want to come into the lab, I can show you real sheep hearts. We actually have a real human cadaver here at MCC too, so if at some time you guys wanted to come in to see that, we could show you that too. But if you're doing a dissection, again, if you're writing it down, you've got to say, you can't just say cut it in half. Cut it in half, I can cut it this way in half, I can cut it that way in half, etc. So you need specific terms. So what we have is different planes or body sections that have specific terms. So you don't like to think of somebody getting cut in half, but that's our example here, okay? So this woman here, this unfortunate woman, is being cut in half in various ways. This one right here is called a sagittal cut, okay? So sagittal, I'm going to put in something here. Doesn't give me a lot of room to write. So sagittal is S-A-G-I-T-T-A-L, like that, okay? A sagittal cut, if I can move it somewhere you can read it a little bit better. So a sagittal cut is going to divide whatever it is into a left and a right side, okay? Now, a sagittal cut, it doesn't matter if, if you're thinking like, okay, somebody came up, again, it's like Halloween, right? Somebody cut off my arm. Okay, now there's the left and the right side. My left arm is over there on the ground, my right arm, the rest of me is over here, okay? That would be a sagittal cut. There's a left and a right to me now. A mid-sagittal cut is what you're seeing right there. It's exactly along the midline, and it divides whatever it is into exactly equal left and right halves. A mid-sagittal cut, okay? Now we also have the next one, which is called a horizontal or transverse cut. Okay? And that one's kind of self-explanatory, right? So for that one, it's going across. It divides it into an upper and a lower part. Okay? And again, it could be anywhere along there. Chopping your head off, that would count as a transverse or horizontal cut. Okay, the last one that we have here is called a frontal or a coronal cut. And that one, as you see, divides the heart or the body or whatever into an anterior and a posterior, a front and a back. Okay? So it would be pretty important, like we said, if you were cutting up a heart, you need to know exactly which way to cut it. There's one more that's not listed on here, but you sometimes see, and that is called an oblique cut. Okay? And an oblique cut would be something like this. Okay? It would be at some other angle different from these, which are normally at 90 degrees, right? Straight up or straight across or something like that. An oblique cut would be something else. Okay? Okay. So, that takes us to the end of our time again, but it also takes us through Chapter 1. So what that means is, in essence, with you reading and going over lecture notes and study guides for Chapter 1, sometime in the near future, you can do that Chapter 1 lecture quiz, okay? Take as much time as you need doing it. Just make sure it gets done at some time, okay? Lab quiz is also due this weekend, so you want to make sure that you do your exercises 1, 2, 3 in the lab manual, and then for the quiz be able to make sure you can answer all those questions. Whenever you think you're ready, go to the lab quiz. You'll have 25 minutes from the time you start it, and you got to save it and submit it. Questions?
For the lab quizzes, it's only open Friday through Sunday, and lecture quizzes.
Yeah, lecture quizzes anytime. Lab quizzes Friday at 8 a.m. till Sunday night midnight. Yes? Yeah, only on chapter 1. Yeah. Yep. That's basically about it. There's some, other individual terms and stuff like that, but as we said, most of what you need to know, you'll find in lecture. Yeah. All right? Yes. Yeah, so for the lab exercises, this is exercise 1, this whole thing. It has to do with introductions. Yeah, 1, 2, 3. So you need to do language, which is